Hello and welcome to today's episode of Talk on Things and Stuff. Today we are continuing our review of the Stuart Udall sequence. And if you remember in the last episode, we learned about Stewart Udall, who was a member of the Mormon Church, who considered himself a Jack Mormon and distanced himself from the church, even as he rose to prominence as the Secretary of the Interior under President JFK. Today, we're going to learn a little bit more about some of the things that happened with Stewart Udall as he became Secretary of the Interior and suddenly had to answer questions in Washington, D.C. about his status as a Mormon at a time when the nation was in the era of desegregation and really wrestling with some of these questions of how groups of people deal with minorities. So, what we're going to do is, let's go ahead and bring up our web site. We're going to go to the Thoughts on Things and Stuff website, and we're going to go to the Stuart Udall sequence. You can just Google Stuart Udall sequence and find it. And when you do, you'll see the 6 different articles. We're going to go to article number 2, An Appeal to the Brethren, Orthodox and Antipathy. When Secretary of Interior Stuart Udall took office, he received criticism about racist Mormon teachings. His exchange with the First Presidency reveals much about the perspective of church leaders at the time. So again, just like last time, we're going to go ahead and read the article. This is really to capture the audio for a subsequent podcast presentation of it. So I'm going to start reading the article, and I may have to stop and restart to fix any audio or misstatements that I do. And we'll just take it from there. And after that, we can take some calls and questions or comments. It's a little bit longer this time than last time, but I think you'll see why. There's a lot that we really need to go through with that. So let's go ahead and make this full screen, and we will go to Stuart Udall sequence part 2. All right. Stuart Udall sequence 2. Appeal to the Brethren, Orthodoxy and Antipathy, July 16th, 2015. In part 1, we looked at the life of Stuart Udall, an unconventional Mormon who left Orthodoxy but still acted with principle and conscience. His written statement of reasons he could not remain in full fellowship as a Mormon is very thought-provoking even today. This post will start an examination of a defining moment in the intersection between the life of Mr. Udall and the Mormon faith. It's centered around the question of race in LDS theology and practice. Background. In the 1960s, Stuart Udall was one of the most visible Mormon government officials. He had served 3 terms as a U.S. congressman representing his home state of Arizona, and in 1961, newly elected President John F. Kennedy selected Udall to sit in his cabinet as Secretary of the Interior. After the death of Kennedy, Udall continued to serve under President Johnson. We discussed in a prior post how Udall diverged from the church in his attitude towards black people, rejecting the notion of a curse and advocating racial equality and civil rights. Remember that he worked to desegregate the cafeteria at the University of Arizona even before the law required it. He had also joined the NAACP. Despite this track record, his affiliation with the Mormon Church raised questions for Stuart while acting as Secretary of the Interior. Comments received. One such question arose while he was in the very act of advancing civil rights. Early in his time as Secretary of the Interior, Udall played a direct role in integrating the last segregated football team in the NFL. Quote, "The Redskins, the last team in any major professional sport to integrate, were set to begin playing in a new stadium, which Mr. Udall later named for Robert F. Kennedy. The stadium sat on the land owned by the National Park. Service. In March of 1961, Mr. Udall sent a sharply worded letter to the Redskin owner, George Preston Marshall, warning him that he was in danger of criminal prosecution if the team violated anti-discrimination laws. In 1962, Bobby Mitchell became the first black player to take the field for the Redskins." Unquote. That's from a profile on Stuart Udall in the Washington Post. Now, Udall's letter to Marshall made national headlines, and it was over this issue that he received a letter from a Mormon branch president in Georgia, which pointed out a contradiction. From that letter, quote, "Now, as a member of the most segregated organization on earth, how can you tell a man to hire on a ball club? Is it constitutional? Please don't be victimized by the seed of Cain." Letter to Stuart Udall, March 28, 1961. And if you go to archive.org, you can see the actual letter written to him by a branch president in Georgia. And you can see that Stuart saved this in his files, which are now at the University of Arizona archives, from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Valdosta Branch Presidency, Florida Mission, March 28, 1961, with the signature of the branch president. In addition to Mormons questioning his commitment to Mormonism in view of his actions on civil rights, there were non-Mormon black people who questioned his commitment to civil rights in view of his status as a Mormon. In September of 1961, Udall received a note and a related letter from the editor of the Washington Afro-American. A reader of that newspaper had sent a letter to the editor which asked, quote, "I would be willing to gamble that Secretary of Interior Udall advertises big and acts mighty small on how much he hates discrimination. Mr. Udall is said to be a Mormon holding a profound antipathy towards our colored race. How many Negroes does Secretary Udall have on his team or personal staff? I'll wager he has exactly the same number of GS-15 or higher positions in the Secretary's office at Interior as Prince George County has on their school board. For equality's sake, why not get an answer?" Letter to the editor, September 11th, 1961. Now, Prince George County was the county that Brown versus Board of Education, the legal challenge to the policy of segregation in the nation, was originally brought for. Okay, so the editor of the Washington Afro-American passed that letter on with a comment of his own stating, "Now, we don't believe that a man's religion determines to any appreciable extent his feeling towards Negroes, but it is generally believed in America that Mormons are anti-Negro. However, we eventually intend to get some answers about the Department of the Interior and the extent to which Negroes are working and being promoted to higher grades." Chuck Sumner Stone, editor, Washington Afro-American, letter to Stuart Udall, 12 September 1961. It's clear that any Mormon holding public office in the 1960s would face greater scrutiny because of the church's continued discrimination. Memo to the First Presidency. Just a few days after receiving these last few letters, Udall forwarded all 3 letters to the First Presidency of the Church with a note expressing concern about the increasing scrutiny that church members are facing because of the priesthood ban. Quote, "I'm deeply concerned over the growing criticism of our church with regard to the issues of racial equality and the rights of minority groups. My immediate concern has been elicited by such things as the 3 letters which I am enclosing and the casual comments, but of greater importance have been the inquiries and comments which from time to time have been directed to me personally by leaders who have prominence in our nation's capital. Unquestionably, the sensitivity of the American people on this question is deepening. It is my judgment that unless something is done to clarify the official position of the Church, these sentiments will become more intense and vocal, and sooner or later I fear they will become the subject of widespread public comment and controversy. Under the circumstance, and in the spirit of humility, I felt that I should convey my concern to you. I strongly feel that this deserves your wise attention, and I stand ready to give assistance or counsel if such should be in order. Sincerely, Stuart L. Udall, Secretary of the Interior." This is from a letter to Stuart Udall to the First Presidency dated 18 September 1961. The Presidency responds. A response was promptly received from the First Presidency. You can see the original letter signed here, I encourage you to read it first and come to your own conclusions. What they had to say is worth reviewing. After acknowledging his letter and the importance of the question, the response began. Quote, "We hasten to assure you that this is a matter which has received the closest, the wisest, and we hope the most inspired attention of which the brethren are capable. In considering this question in the past, practically every president of the church has made some statement in reference thereto. When we read the 3 letters which you enclosed to President McKay, his immediate comment was, 'We admit Negroes to the church by baptism, but we do not let them receive the priesthood.' We have always felt that we could do more for the Negro than any other church. We know that through baptism, the door to the celestial kingdom of God is opened." Letter from the First Presidency to Stuart Udall, 27 September 1961. Now, this start seems promising at first if you have a limited view that the priesthood ban simply means that you don't get the priesthood. Then you might think that the above statement is sufficient. Now, I refer you to the post, quote, I too have been born of goodly parents, so that you can see that the ban had much deeper and significant impact on the lives of black men and women. From that more complete perspective, the opening statement is woefully short-sighted. However, the letter continues. And this is continuing the letter from the First Presidency. Quote, "In 1949, the First Presidency, after discussion with the Council of the 12, wrote the following, quote, the attitude of the church with reference to Negroes remains as it has always stood. It is not a matter of the declaration of a policy, but of direct commandment from the Lord, on which is founded the doctrine of the church from the days of its organization, to the effect that Negroes may become members of the church, but that they are not entitled to the priesthood at present time. The prophets of the Lord have made several statements as to the operation of the principle. President Brigham Young said, 'Why are so many of the inhabitants of the earth cursed with a skin of blackness? It comes in consequence of their fathers rejecting the power of the holy priesthood and the law of God. They will go down to death, and when all the rest of the children have received their blessings in the holy priesthood, then that curse will be removed from the seed of Cain, and they will come up and possess the priesthood and receive all the blessings which we are now entitled to.' President Woodruff made the following statement, The day will come when all that race will be redeemed and possess all the blessings which we now have." End quote. Now keep in mind that this is the highest level of church authority instructing the highest ranking Mormon in U.S. government on church doctrine. Now, in the past, people have quibbled over whether the priesthood ban was policy or doctrine, and here, the First Presidency is stating unequivocally that it is neither. In the above section, the brethren state that the priesthood ban is a direct commandment from the Lord. Now, if God's commandments are the foundation of doctrine, which is then the basis of policy, then the priesthood ban was part of the most fundamental basis of the church. It is conceded that it may one day be lifted, but it is given the highest level of sanction possible at the time. Now, the letter from the brethren continues with the remainder of the 1949 statement. Reading from the letter again, quote, "The position of the church regarding the Negro may be understood when another doctrine of the church is kept in mind, namely that the conduct of spirits in the premortal existence has some determining effect upon the conditions and circumstances under which these spirits take mortality, and that while the details of this principle have not been made known, the principle itself indicates that the coming to this earth and taking on mortality is a privilege that is given to those who maintain their first estate, and that the worth of the privilege is so great that spirits are willing to come to earth and take on bodies, no matter what the handicap may be as to the kind of bodies they are to secure, and that among the handicaps, failure of the right to enjoy immortality, the blessings of the priesthood, is a handicap which spirits are willing to assume in order that they might come to earth. Under this principle, there is no injustice whatsoever involved in this deprivation as to the holding of the priesthood by the Negroes." End quote. Now, while the prior section described the reality and the origin of this ban, this section describes the reason for the ban. The First Presidency here is describing some of the ideas that were declared false and disavowed in the Race and the Priesthood Gospel Topic essay on LDS.org. The fact that they are teaching false concepts as the doctrine of God is one reason that people have difficulty reconciling the words of the prophets with that essay. The idea that less valiant spirits in the premortal life were punished by receiving less than optimal bodies and living conditions through race or handicap is one of the most insidious and pernicious, vile doctrines that ever darkened the pulpits of Mormonism. It gave divine sanction for people to harbor racism in their heart and show it with their words and actions because they believed that those people were simply getting justice for their past, less valiant choices. Now, I've written about this before in Mormon Handicaps. One reason that this false teaching was so attractive is that it seemed to help make sense of the world. Since Mormons believe that God is a being of perfect justice, then it didn't make sense that some people would be born in lower stations than others by race or nationality or physical handicap. By making those things a deserved disadvantage in this life resulting from premortal sin, it restores the notion of a perfect divine justice. I wrote about this and the evolution of this thinking in the blog post, The Mormon Ring of Power, The First Estate. Now, continuing with the letter from the brethren to Stuart Udall. Quote, "There are several other statements that have been made and letters written upon the subject. We thought it might be of interest to you to have a letter written to a prominent educator in July of 1947, from which we quote the entire substance. Quote, we make this initial remark. The social side of the restored gospel is only an incident of it. It is not the end thereof. The basic element of your ideas and concepts seems to be that all God's children stand in equal positions before Him in all things. Your knowledge of the gospel will indicate to you that this is contrary to the very fundamentals of God's dealings with Israel, dating from the time of His promise to Abraham regarding Abraham's seed and their position vis-a-vis God Himself. Indeed, some of God's children were assigned to superior positions before the world was formed. We are aware that some higher critics do not accept this, but the church does. Your position seems to lose sight of the revelations of the Lord touching the pre-existence of our spirits, the rebellion in heaven, and the doctrines that our birth into this life and the advantages under which we may be born have a relationship in the life heretofore. From the days of the prophet Joseph even until now, it has been the doctrine of the church, never questioned by any of the church leaders, that the Negroes are not entitled to the full blessings of the gospel. Furthermore, your ideas, as we understand them, appear to contemplate the intermarriage of the Negro and white races, a concept which has heretofore been most repugnant to most normal-minded people from the ancient patriarchs till now. God's rule for Israel, His chosen people, has been endogamous. Modern Israel has been similarly directed. We're not unmindful of the fact that there is a growing tendency, particularly among some educators, as it manifests itself in this area, towards the breaking down of race barriers in the matter of intermarriage between whites and blacks, but it does not have the sanction of the church and is contrary to church doctrine. You will see that President McKay's remarks at the moment are in keeping with the statements of his predecessors." End quote from the letter. Now, here, the First Presidency is quoting the response that was given to LDS sociologist Lowry Nelson when he previously wrote to them on the matter of race. Nelson responded to each of the above quoted points with a rebuttal that was rejected by the prophet at the time, but is now accepted as fact. You can see the Lowry Nelson exchange for full details, particularly the section titled Dr. Nelson's Bold Reply to the Prophet, in which he rebuts each of these points. Now, having past prophets reject truth given to them by members while holding on to now disavowed, false, repugnant teachings handed down to them from prior prophets is one reason why people are having a hard time accepting that church leaders have any special connection to God or any ability to discern truth. The same thing is true of the response given to Stuart Udall in this letter. Now, the letter from the brethren to Stuart Udall continues. Now, so far as the Tuella Now, so far as the Tooele situation is concerned, we must leave it entirely to the community of Tooele. Whether they welcome the Negro, lend him money, or what they do is their responsibility. The fact is that we do not welcome Negroes into social affairs because if we did, it would lead to intermarriage, and we do not favor intermarriage. We recommend that Negroes marry Negroes and that whites marry whites, and we cannot modify this statement. We recommend that Japanese marry Japanese and that Hawaiians marry Hawaiians. The cross between the Hawaiian and the Chinese makes a good citizen, and we do not oppose it, but we look with disfavor upon Negroes marrying whites for their own happiness. The only reason we object to their social participation is because that it inevitably will lead to intermarriage, and we cannot change that until the Lord gives a revelation otherwise." End quote. Now, Tooele was a nearby community 35 miles southwest of Salt Lake City that, at the time Stuart Udall had written this letter, had seen remarkable growth and an influx of non-LDS people from many different nationalities and cultures, including black families. Mining and military installations had drawn in laborers and personnel from many walks of life. The First Presidency makes the point that regardless of how blacks are received in nearby communities, for the part of Mormons, social segregation and anti-miscegenation are inextricably linked, and the church endorsed rule. Anti-miscegenation is a hallmark of racism. Now, there's an image here in the blog post that is 3 different excerpts. The first shows a man in a Ku Klux Klan hood in front of a flaming cross, holding his hand up. And the quote is from a pamphlet of the Ku Klux Klan called The Ideals of the Ku Klux Klan. And it reads as follows: "It has become necessary to devise some means for the preservation of white blood in its purity, because despite prohibitive laws, racial intermixture is continuing and the problem of mixed blood is becoming more and more acute." Again, this is an example of a doctrine of anti-miscegenation, where people are using reasons to teach against people of different races marrying. Then you have a quote from Adolf Hitler from his document Mein Kampf, with a picture of Hitler also raising his hand. "Blood mixture and the resultant drop in the racial level is the sole cause of the dying out of old cultures. For men do not perish as the result of lost wars, but by the loss of that force of resistance which is contained only in pure blood." And then finally, you have a quote from the Book of Mormon, attributed to God, that teaches the same type of doctrine, advocating against mixing of blood or mixing of seed. Quote, "And thus saith the Lord God, I will cause that they shall be loathsome unto thy people, save they shall repent of their iniquities, and cursed shall be the seed of him that mixeth with their seed, for they shall be cursed even with the same cursing. And the Lord spake it, and it was done." Book of Mormon, 2 Nephi, chapter 5, verses 22 and 23. Now, clearly, this policy of anti-miscegenation has roots in Mormon scripture. Now, the letter from the brethren to Stuart Udall continues. "The Church maintains that all citizens are, under the Constitution of the United States, as it has been amended, entitled to all the freedom and to all the liberties guaranteed by the Constitution. Negroes who are converted to the principles of the restored gospel, as promulgated by the Church, are entitled to membership in the Church upon being properly baptized, and, except for the holding of the priesthood, are entitled to blessings and privileges otherwise granted to members of the Church. You no doubt are aware of the fact that the prophet Joseph Smith was against slavery, and that the anti-slavery beliefs of the Church under Joseph Smith are credited by some as being one of the chief causes of their troubles in Missouri, and the terrible persecutions which were endured by our people in that state. Furthermore, the prophet announced that if he had the power, he would free all the slaves, and curiously, his plan was to buy the slaves their freedom." Now, the idea, and that's the end of that quote from the letter, now the idea that Mormons were anti-slavery and this caused them difficulties in Missouri is often repeated as a testimony of the progressive and enlightened position of the Church since its founding. However, a close inspection of the events of the church at that time in history reveals that while the church did initially publish what would appear to be an invitation for free slaves to join their community, they spent much more time attempting to disavow that notion and to prove to their non-LDS neighbors that they did not oppose slavery. One example is a letter that Joseph caused to be published, which provided scriptural justification for slavery. This letter, authored by Joseph Smith, directed to Oliver Cowdery, was the subject of a prior blog post called Joseph Smith versus the Abolitionists, and was also used by Apostle Delbert Stapley to prove to Governor George Romney that Joseph did not support equal rights for black people, which was the subject of another blog post called George Romney and the Delbert Stapley letter, which I invite you to read on the website. Now, another example is seen in the Declaration of Belief made shortly after leaving Missouri that is now recorded in the Doctrine and Covenants. Quote, we believe it just to preach the gospel to the nations of the earth and warn the righteous to save themselves from the corruption of the world, but we do not believe it right to interfere with bondservants, neither preach the gospel to nor baptize them contrary to the will and wish of their masters, nor to meddle with or influence them in the least, to cause them to be dissatisfied with their situations in this life, thereby jeopardizing the lives of men. Such interference we believe to be unlawful and unjust and dangerous to the peace of every government allowing human beings to be held in servitude. Doctrine and Covenants, section 134, verse 12, can be found on lds.org. Now, here, Joseph and the leaders of the early church are specifically stating that it is a greater injustice to teach the gospel to black men and support their freedom than it is to keep them as slaves. These are not anti-slavery sentiments. Now, Joseph's plan to free the slaves, articulated during his 1844 presidential campaign, was a calculated and politically savvy compromise which appealed to the Northerners desiring an end to slavery and to Southerners concerned about property rights. It was based on the idea that slavery was scripturally justified and approved of God, but was not It was based on the idea that slavery was scripturally justified and approved by God, but was an undesirable arrangement. This position was also taken by Brigham Young. And you can see the quote from Brigham Young supporting this position. From his address to the legislature in 1852, quote, I will remark with regard to slavery, inasmuch as we believe in the Bible, inasmuch as we believe in the ordinance of God, in the priesthood and order and decrees of God, we must believe in slavery. This colored race have been subjected to severe curses, which they have in their families and their classes and their various capacities brought upon themselves. And until the curse is removed by him who placed it upon them, they must suffer its consequences. I am not authorized to remove it. I am a firm believer in slavery. Brigham Young, address to the Utah legislature, 23 January 1852, can be read on lds.org and archive.org. Now, ardent abolitionists viewed Scripture differently, and they saw that since no man can possess the title or deed to another, then there is no compensation that can be justified for the purchase of a man's freedom. An example of this can be seen in its earliest state with something called the selling of Joseph. And this is worth going into a brief sidebar on. So the selling of Joseph is the first printed, documented abolitionist paper. This is a digital scan of the selling of Joseph, and it is, let's see, it's a document that, if we go back here, was printed in 1700. Now imagine this. This is over 100 years before Joseph Smith even was born. And its author was a judge in Massachusetts named Samuel Sewall. And if you are familiar with some of Massachusetts history, then you'll know that the name of Samuel Sewall is somewhat notorious because he was one of the judges that oversaw the Salem witch trials And the unique thing about Sewall is he's the only judge that later acknowledged that what happened in the Salem witch trials was an atrocity and a mismanagement of justice, and he issued an apology. If you go to the Massachusetts Capitol building, there's a mural painted on the wall of the moment where he stood up in a legislative session and issued that apology. But one of the other things that he did later in his life was he saw that the nation was using scripture to justify slavery, and he had out of his own funds this pamphlet printed which reviewed many of the scriptural justifications for slavery and refuted them. So this is over 100 years before Joseph Smith was born, where you have people of conscience looking at the issue of slavery and refuting the common held scriptural notions of slavery. So definitely worth checking that out. The Selling of Joseph. All right. And we have a comment that the accents are annoying. I apologize for that. I have to do something for people listening live to distinguish my commentary from the quotes in the letters, and the standard thing in my brain whenever I read racist things is like a weird Southern accent, and so I apologize. You just have to live with that. Okay, so the first presidency then concludes, quote, "We are in entire accord with a statement President Clark once made. I have the deepest and most profound sympathy for the position of the Negro, which, looked at from the earthly point of view, is perhaps not explainable, but neither is the position of the Indian nor the Australian bushman. However, as you may or may not know, there are in our philosophy some principles which may account for these mortal inequalities." End quote. Now, by describing the, quote, Negro, Indian, and Bushman in these terms, the first presidency is taking a position of racial superiority. The idea that while people are, that white, let me start again. The first presidency is taking the position of racial superiority. The idea that white people are superior in certain characteristics, traits, and attributes than other races, and so those races should be pitied. What are the principles of Mormon philosophy that they refer to which may explain mortal inequalities of the races? These are best summarized by the words of Apostle Mark E. Peterson. Quote, "With all this in mind, can we account in any other way for the birth of some of the children of God in darkest Africa, or in flood-ridden China, or among the starving hordes of India, while some of the rest of us are born here in the United States? We cannot escape the conclusion that because of performance in our pre-existence, some of us are born as Chinese, some as Japanese, some as Indians, some as Negroes, some as Americans, some as Latter-day Saints. These are rewards and punishments, fully in harmony with his established policy in dealing with sinners and saints, rewarding all according to their deeds." This is from Race Problems as They Affect the Church by Mark E. Peterson from 27 August 1954. The only way in which all these other races and nationalities may be considered punishments is with the idea that white Americans are superior. Now, this toxic idea of racial superiority presents a conflict with the notions of a fair God, and so the concept of race as a punishment for premortal performance is invoked to harmonize God and justice. It makes a sort of sick sense from the twisted perspective of using religious dogma as justification for white supremacy. And as we see in this letter, such ideas persisted at the highest levels of the church authority even into the mid-20th century. Now, the letter from the brethren to Stuart Udall concludes, quote, "The likelihood of moving into Tooele a large group of Negro families has been brought to our attention previously by our mutual friend, Eugene Merrill. We do not anticipate any trouble. We have good leadership in the two stakes in Tooele, and believe that both from a church and a civic standpoint that the community will adapt itself to whatever circumstances and conditions may arise. Thank you very kindly for your interest once again. We are faithfully your brethren. And it's signed by Brother Moyle and Brother Brown from the First Presidency. Now, remember that Tooele had seen rapid, diverse growth related to mining and military industries. This would draw a more racially diverse element than typically seen in Utah. And earlier in the letter, the First Presidency established that segregation was the rule for the church in mixed societies. Remember the quote, "The fact is that we do not welcome Negroes into social affairs because if we did, it would lead to intermarriage, and we do not favor intermarriage." That's a quote from the letter. Now, with that in mind, it makes sense that the LDS stakes would adapt to any changes in the racial composition of the community by segregation. Adaptation by segregation. Conclusion. Stuart Udall was a Jack Mormon with a conscience. He acknowledged truth within his heart about the worth of all men, black or white, despite what the church had taught on the matter. Like Lowry Nelson in 1947, he wrote to the source to see if there was any hope for new light on this issue. Nelson's communication with the First Presidency in the 1940s represented a leader in academic sociology confronting the racism of Mormon doctrine and practice. Udall's communication at the end of the 1960s, or the beginning of the 1960s, came from the world of civic government. In both instances, the reply from the brethren was unequivocal. Racial superiority, religious white supremacy, and anti-miscegenation were as much Mormon doctrine as the atonement itself, a direct commandment from the Lord. Now remember that after the prophet rejected Lowry Nelson's scriptural and sociological arguments for racial equality, Nelson wrote to a national newspaper or magazine publication. Nelson wrote to a national publication to bring attention to the issue and push for change. Nelson was a lowly academic sociologist. Stuart Udall was the highest-ranking Mormon political figure in the nation, who sat in the cabinet of the President of the United States. If Udall were to make a public appeal in much the same way that Lowry Nelson did, how much greater would the impact be? Next. Well, it turns out that this is exactly what Stuart Udall did. In our next post, we will examine Secretary Udall's appeal for full fellowship for the Negro, a letter he wrote to the editor of Dialogue magazine, and we'll see what he had to say. And that ends the blog post of Stuart Udall sequence number 2, Orthodoxy and Antipathy, where we examined Stuart Udall's letter to the brethren warning them that the nation is starting to see and talk and be concerned more about the Mormon Church's doctrine and history regarding race, and the very illuminating response that Udall got from the brethren, which again affirmed the racist teachings and ideas which had been used to justify the church policy and doctrine on black families all the way back from Joseph Smith himself. So that is that. Now we have some time. If anyone would like to make some calls, I need to just set some things up. Give me a second, and we'll go ahead and put the number up there. If anyone is interested in calling, feel free to do that. I'm going to set that up. If you'll give me just a second here. All right. Okay, I think we have everything set up. If you have any comments to make on what we've read, or anything about the issue of race in Mormonism, then feel free to call. The number is 210-422-2222. Let's see. In the meantime, let's go through some of the comments. We have somebody who's commenting, pointing out that while Brigham Young advocated for slavery, James Strang fought against slavery and advocated for protection and freedom of the natives in Michigan. And that is an argument that some people could say points to James Strang, who was one of the kind of competitors to the mantle of Joseph Smith. After Joseph Smith died, he started an offshoot branch known as the Strangites that actually attracted some significant followers. The question is, does the fact that he had a more enlightened position on race validate his claim to be the true, subsequent prophet after Joseph Smith? I think while it may be commendable that he had a more enlightened position, it really does not validate any particular claim. And it doesn't really invalidate any claim to any divine connection either. The best proof of this, in my mind, is when you look at the kind of the life and ministry of Jim Jones. People's Temple, he had, at a time when the nation was wrestling with the issue of segregation and integration, he had very enlightened and progressive ideas about the equality of men and women regardless of race. But that did not change the fact that he ended up leading, a group of his followers to a very dastardly end in Jonestown. All right, so let's see here. Rational Guy says, but God changed his mind, so all is okay. Pay no attention to those prophets behind the curtain. This is probably, it's kind of a restatement of a song in the Book of Mormon musical called I Believe. If you have a chance to listen to the song, it's a missionary who, kind of in the last throw of his desire to really be, the best missionary, sings a song called I Believe, and he starts talking about a lot of the Mormon teachings, and at the end of it, near the apex of the song, he says, and I believe that in 1978, God changed his mind about black people. And the thing that just seems to be obvious to everybody outside of Mormonism is that the idea that God would have to change his mind about black people points to the idea that people telling you that they speak for God don't actually speak for God. All they're doing is repeating the bigotry and bias that exists in their own very human minds and hearts, and just putting the name of God as a heading over it. And certainly, it'd be easy to point that out in anybody else. For Mormons, it's harder to see it in your own leaders. All right. Well, if we don't have any callers, then we can go ahead and wrap this up. It was a little bit of a longer article to read. We're at 45 minutes now. I had planned to go for about an hour. Let me see if there's anything else worth looking at here. Well, one of the things that, if you do get a chance to go to the Thoughts on Things and Stuff blog and check out the article, which I'll go ahead and put some links in the comments of these posts on Facebook and YouTube so you guys can go directly there. It's really interesting. There's one master document of all of the source letters from Stuart Udall's archives that have been digitized in, and you can go and you can see the scanned letters with the church letterhead, the signature of the first presidency. Just because I know when I was studying a lot of this stuff, I was like, this sounds compelling, but how do I know this isn't totally made up and then attributed to the first presidency? Because Satan will lie and deceive and clearly wants to make the brethren look like racist people in the past. And so when you go and you look at those documents, you can see the signature of the brethren, and it just affirms that this is actually a real document. It came from the prophet in the 1960s to the Secretary of Interior, and it really is revealing about what they thought at that time. Regardless of what the church now says, when it says it devours things and it calls those old teachings folklore, traditions, the racist notions held by everybody in America, if you go back there and you see there were a lot of people who were not Mormon, who were Christians or other faiths, who had much more progressive and enlightened ideals about universal brotherhood at a time when the church was entrenched in the ideas of racism that informed its policies. And you can see in the justifications that the brethren used, they're appealing back to the statements of prior prophets. And so it's those statements of their predecessors which kept them trapped and entrenched in their dogmatic racism. And the justification was, well, all these prior prophets have made statements that support what we hold, and so we have to believe it until God issues another revelation. And so you can see that whole notion keeps people trapped in racist ideas. Okay, it looks like we may have a call. Hello, you're on Talk on Things and Stuff.
Hello.
Hey, what's on your mind?
Hey, are we live?
Yeah, we are.
Yeah. Oh, that's great.
There may be a little bit of a delay if you're watching.
I'm actually calling from Sweden.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah. I've been following you for a little while. I think you're very clever. And how can I say, about the issues of racism and so I think there is no doubt about that. It has always been there. I myself have been a member almost my entire life. I'm actually originally from Brazil. Have moved here 12 years ago because of Sweden I met in US. But anyway, I left the church last year after a long period of not so long of research, like you know, a lot of whistleblowers and so. And my question or commentary that I'd like to make in the show there is that I'm just trying to understand why there are so members still not willing to research on their own. Because, in a way, I understand. I always look into those things as anti-Mormon propaganda, didn't believe in those absurd things and so. But when we tell them, hey, go to Mormon, I mean now it's LDS, what is it called? The Church of Jesus Christ or Latter-day Saints or
LDS.org is way easier. It still works too.
Yeah, and go to the what is it called? Their database and just write gospel topic essays.
Yeah.
But they started already. They were forced to recognize some points and so. But people they don't dare. Yeah. And a lot of friends here, I have to say, here in Sweden, they shun on me or lost contact, and look at me kind of like I'm more like crazy dude or so, start to live my own life. I'm just trying to understand that because I've noticed that it's like everywhere, even there in US, I know that a lot of people have started to look into things themselves and do their own research and leave the church. Some people I know they have a hard time because of the family, and this and that. But I'm just trying to understand why people in general in a society where we live today with so much easy access to free research, they still don't dare to just look into it. Even the young generation, they just go with that, thinking, listen to the church leaders and so and so. And I just wanted to hear what you have to say or anybody there.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. No, thanks for the comment. The question that you're asking is one that really I struggled with, because when I started to learn this stuff, I had asked myself, how is it that I, as almost a 40-year-old man, born and raised in this church, didn't know about some of this stuff? How could I have missed it? And when
I was the same way. I'm about your age. I just turned 40 last week, so okay. Very similar. So very similar like you.
And so I was trying to understand it, and this is where my study of other groups that I found had so many parallels with Mormonism in how they controlled their members really informed me. And when you listen to academic researchers who study the phenomenon that has been given the name undue influence, we hear people call different groups cults and everything like that, and that's not a very helpful name. But what it is it captures groups that use these forms of psychological manipulation in order to maintain and hold over the minds of people that follow it. And you'll hear things like indoctrination or brainwashing, and those are high-level concepts. When you dig down and say, okay, what are the actual tools that keep somebody trapped into false ideas, then through studying various groups, they've been able to kind of tease out and give names to various things. And believe it or not, a lot of this research started in the study of the Communist Revolution of China. And there was an Air Force psychologist who went and researched and talked to people who were coming out of the prisons of Communist China, trying to figure out what happened that led to the Communist Revolution. And a lot of the principles and ideas that he articulated there were the foundation for subsequent research into group mind control or undue influence. And so the name given to what we're talking about right now is called Milieu Control. And Milieu Control...
what did you say? Mutual control? What did you say?
Milieu Control. It's Mileau. I may have misspelled that, but it's Milieu Control. So milieu is just a word describing, the environment that you live in. And the idea of milieu control was that the group controlled what information that members had access to. And that...
can I ask a question?
Sure.
Very, very, very quick. Because, if I understand it correctly, you're saying that you originated from, actually from the communist China and so forth. I actually thought that it came from the CIA, with the MK Ultra studies there in U.S., with all those Nazis that they took after the Second World War. I thought that was during the World War, and after especially all those, what is it called, mind control and mass influence.
Well, the thing about...
But you're saying they came actually from China?
Well, when you talk about MK Ultra and you dig into the published previously confidential information about that, a lot of that was using chemical substances to try to alter the mindset of people. And that's one subset of how people's ideas and motivations and identity could be influenced. But this is something totally separate. This is just groups that have evolved, or charismatic leaders that evolved to plug into some of just normal aspects of human psychology to control people. And there's the principle of milieu control, which is that you are, as the group, controlling which information that your members have access to. So if I grew up in the church and I had no idea that the church had previously taught really terrible, repugnant, racist ideas as the Word of God, well, the reason I didn't know any of that is that the church had whitewashed its manuals. It would give quotes and it would exclude the racist part of the quotes. Or we would have a lesson on Scripture, but we would never cover like that quote from the Doctrine and Covenants. We would never cover that particular quote, so I never had to confront the reality.
And all the other people that went against it, they always used to call them as what is it called, apostates.
Yes. So what I'm trying to lay out is that
invert the story.
Yeah. There's different ways to affect that type of information control. One of them is to whitewash your history so that you only present the good parts and you don't present the bad parts, okay? So then there's another thing, which is, and that's kind of like you're controlling by excluding information. Then there's something that's just outright deception, and that is where you portray and give a history that is completely false. So there's a quote from a General Conference where a general authority, one of the 70s, stands up, and one of the money quote from him is, I'm so glad that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints from its beginning has stood against all racism of any type. And when I was a believing member, and I can give you a link to that, but when I was a believing member, I heard that and it didn't cause me I was like proud. I'm like, yeah, I'm a Mormon. We've always stood against racism. But when you then educate yourself on the real history of Mormonism, you're like, that is an outright lie. That is insulting to members.
You become disgusted.
Yeah, and it really does fuel your disgust.
Can we say that Sunday, what is it called, the testimony meeting, all those things that they do every single month, and all those, going to church every Sunday. That's kind of like still like a kind of a control
Yeah. Oh,
basis
you're absolutely right.
to.
And the thing is, you know, required attendance at meetings, testimony, all those different things you find echoes and reflection of in various other groups. And they don't have to be religious groups. They can be political groups. They can be self-help groups. There's all
Oh
different
yes,
types of
yes,
things.
yeah.
But when you talk about the information control, you've got whitewashing, you've got outright deception, and then there's one of the probably the most effective thing, which is you use fear, uncertainty, and doubt to paint anyone who would actually tell you real history that's troubling as an outsider and an apostate. And you tell your members that people who would disparage the prophet or people who would bring any of this other information out are doing the will of Satan or are out to
they're
get
of
you.
the devil.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what I noticed, because I myself used to look at them like that, because like I said, I'm from Brazil, but I served a full-time mission there like from 2000 to 2002 in Utah.
Yeah.
In the Salt Lake City, the
Yeah.
South Mission. So I came across a lot of people that were anti-Mormon, this and that. And every time somebody were just trying to share something, to me, I was always like taking distance. That was like where I first heard of the, what is it called, that the Mountains of Massacre.
Yeah, the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Yeah.
And all of the other things, and like I thought it was, absurd. And then later, after I went to BYU there and lived there for almost 10 years, I found out it was true, and I was like, what? And then you start to, I understand what you're saying, like, because they paint all the other whistleblowers, anybody that says something against them, like they are of the devil. And but that's what I noticed, because every time when I come to even like some people that I thought were my friends, and just tell them like, hey, go check this out. You don't need to listen to me. Go check this information, this and that, and then like when they can't argue, they start bearing their testimony. Oh, I know, the prophet, blah blah blah, and that this was a prophet. I noticed that's kind of like their mantra. They give their testimony. It's their defense system, and I understand what you mean, all these techniques and so. And I noticed that, because I always wondered also myself since I was little, growing up in the church, why we have to have a general conference every 6 months, and for like the whole weekend, hours and hours. I don't believe any other institution has something like that. And it's always the same messages, the same things, there's like, but we learned by repetition, but now looking back, I can see it's pretty much kind of like a way of them controlling the members to keep listening to them. And I just think it's so sad, because I see a lot of the young generation that knows so much about the internet, social media, and so that they are still kind of like attached to that, like they can get away from it, And
well, one of the things that you said earlier about how even in this information age, people seem to be locked down to controlled information. I think the reason that we're seeing what church leaders have said, kind of a wave of apostasy, is that before the church could literally like capture this information, it's stored away in a dusty library and nobody has access to it, and so nobody can actually know what it is. But now that we are after the work of Sandra Tanner, where they went and got some of those old documents and mimeographed them and published them so that people could see them, and now that it's digitized and you can in sacrament meeting or in seminary on your smartphone, pull I lost my connection there for a second, but now people do have access, and the church is not able to actually control information in the way that it did in the past, and that is why, as you said, the church is now having to concede things that they tried things that they previously had. Things that they previously had to try to hide and deny, they now have to confront and acknowledge, because people are going to know. And, like you said, once people learn that the church has been lying to them, it creates a great deal of anger because we don't want to be lied to, particularly from people who claim to be the messengers of God, the mouthpiece of God, and who should be held to a higher standard from that. But
I can say from my own experience to the listeners there, if they are listening, I can probably most of you, or maybe all of you, I don't know, have the same experience. My first reaction first was denial. I was like, no, it can't be. It can't be. I remember I was just shocked, and then once I saw that it was true, checked by myself, and then the first reaction, like you said, it was anger. I was pissed off. I felt like cheated. I'm not just talking about the tithing but all the feelings, the time I spent, the church was like my life, But then, not long after that, actually, my reaction turned into despair. I was like scared to death. Because I was like, what am I going to do? Where am I going to go? And what are we going to do now? But I found actually a whole new life afterwards, and I feel more inspired now. I receive more revelations easier and faster than before, like what to do when I pray, talk to God, and so compared to before when we felt like that pressure, of all the things we had to do, and then we had to comply to everything. But my last question to you, because I need to hang up soon, because I'm calling from the other side of the phone. How is the status there today? Because I try to keep in touch with some friends that are still there. Some people I lost contact. How is it going on there? Like, is it still like the Great Awakening continuing, or have them be able to kind of like stop it and so? The church?
I think the church has done a number of things to try to stem the tide of people leaving Mormonism, things that would tend to soften its impact on people's lives. So you have shortening of the church day from 3 hours to 2 hours. You've got, and there's a bunch of reasons that they may have done that, but then you've got reconfiguring what missions actually are, so they're not uniformly as grueling as they once were, and they're adapting to service missions, they're adapting to shorter missions for people, and they're trying to destigmatize going home early. There's a bunch of things that they're trying to do to address the way that they believe have been the reasons for people to leave the church. The thing is, they continue to not do the right things on some of the principal reasons that people leave the church. So if the church did acknowledge its full history of racism and apologize, I think that would actually increase people's willingness to stay a member of the congregation and a member of the church, just because they'd say that, this culture that I grew up in has a degree of institutional humility and is willing to deal and wrestle with its past, just like every other institution has. And now I can.
If I may, what is it called? Interrupt you. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Go ahead.
Do you really believe if they would do that, they actually would be better for their public affairs, so to speak? That more people join or would stay compared to the opposite? Because I thought that if they would recognize all those things, it would be pretty much saying, "Oh, the church is true," But it's a good institution. You need the church.
Yeah, I believe it does, probably for one reason, and that is that in 2018, the first presidency was meeting with the head of the NAACP in Salt Lake City. And I asked this question of what would it look like if the church actually did this, did a full-throated apology without holding anything back, full acknowledgement in the same pattern of repentance that they teach us to do. What if the church leaders themselves did that? And so I wrote an apology that was modeled after that and looked real, and I presented it as a sort of satire piece that it's hard because of the milieu control and the distrust that people have about apostates. I knew that if people had seen something that just I had written, they wouldn't actually consider it, and you couldn't get an authentic reaction from it. But if they read something that they thought was coming from the church, then you could kind of see how you would accept it. And it was a misguided thing, and it caused a lot of people some pain. There was some things that we learned from it, though, and that is that in that moment where people thought it was real, people weren't throwing up their hands, trashing their scriptures and saying this church is, ridiculous and wrong. What they were saying is, this is the right thing to do, and I'm so proud that the prophet is doing it. I have more faith in him as the prophet and more faith in the church and in my God and in my identity as a Mormon. And so it actually had the reverse, and people were sharing it. Faithful people were sharing it. And I have a collection of screenshots of some of the reactions, and some of them included because part of the apology was the prophet acknowledging that some aspects of the scripture were racist. And it framed it in a way that is still faith promoting, and that is that, the Book of Mormon says that there may be errors, and they are the errors of men. And so if subsequent prophets say these racist things in the scriptures are the errors of men and we need to repudiate them, then that's okay. That should be fine, and that should be what they do.
I just don't understand how people could still be okay with that when they see, okay, the whole organization is not true. It can be a good organization, but it doesn't come from God.
I think in the past, people
find it absurd, because when I realized that, it was very, very hard. I struggled with seeing myself for like a month or more. I could hardly eat and sleep. But once I accepted, I was like, okay, I can't deny it. I can't just pretend that it's all true, it's okay, I can't go to church and just pretend, because for me it's always like it's either true or not, because before I always believed, regardless of the hardships, some church leaders or members, that would do stupid things, and so I was like, no, but the church is true, but I just find it hard to understand them when they see that it's not true, but they still think that it's good, they should be part of it. Because I can only look into it as in a way a good institution that pretends to do good, but no, it's all false, With all those things coming up about them hitting their wealth, how they could go around like now and from now on without needing any contribution, just living on the interest.
Yeah.
And although I can't remember if it was you or some other whistleblower about the peak advisors.
The ends and peak advisors investment.
Yeah.
So well, what I would say to the point,
I understand how people give money.
Yeah. What I would say to the point that you're talking about is that there are different approaches to religion, and there are different modes of belief and adherence to a group. The perspective that you're talking about and you're describing for yourself is much the same perspective that I and a lot of people of my generation have, which is that the church is objectively and literally true. And so all of its claims are founded on its, all of its influence in my life and in my mind is founded on the necessity of it being true. But that is not the only mode of belief and the only way of interacting with an organization. And if you've gone out and you've explored other churches, then you'll see that a lot of people approach churches as a community, as a culture, as a bunch of believers all struggling together to reach ideals.
To be part of something,
right.
to feel
exactly.
part of a group. Because for me, it was it was nice to have friends, and so it was based on the
literal truth. But there are a lot of people where that no longer is the foundational motivation for them being part of a group. And I think particularly if you talk to some of the younger apologetic type, the neo-apologist people, if you've paid attention to Jackson Washburn and to some of the other younger people, and you're like, why are these young people, falling in with this organization that is founded on lies? Well, a lot of it is that their approach to the organization and to the concept of religion, faith, and God itself is not bound up in these concrete, literal concepts that you and I were, cultivated in. And they are willing to allow that the church is just as flawed and just as problematic as any other organization, and so we need to deal with that. The problem that I have with that is that it's only the members that are making these excuses and softening up the way that they interact with the church. The leaders themselves still hold on to this very literalistic, concrete notion of the church. And so, but eventually that's going to change, and we're seeing that, we have a quote from, I think, now President Nelson, who used to be an apostle, saying that the Book of Mormon is not a history textbook. And we have the church apostles saying that you don't have to have a literalistic view of the Book of Mormon. And so there's space being made for a metaphorical or a literary view of the Book of Mormon, which has kind of historically been how other religions have had to deal with the Bible and some of the difficulties in the Bible. And so if the church makes a full transition to that, then that will be a way for people to continue to participate and even donate to the church. But I think you're right, particularly in view of the amount of wealth that the church has garnished in the past. I fully expect that people will start to consider other priorities in their life before they consider giving money to the church, particularly when you have people who have to choose between feeding their families and feeding the church, it'll
Yep.
be a lot
I had
easier to make that
times like
decision.
that, and friends too. They were like, either pay my bills or the tithe, and then they went, go ahead and pay tithing, or
Yeah.
had to wait, for the church to pay the bills, and sometimes it took time, all the procedure, the bureaucracy, the stake has to approve of the bishop, so yeah, I understand. But I myself, after that, I took distance from religion itself. I believe that it's man-made. I still just have my relationship with God and believe in Christ, just in the Bible, and yeah, try to just live my life to focus on my relationship with God, and I take this from religion, so to speak, from churches, but.
Yeah. And I think going from a high demand, high control religion like Mormonism to something that is very personal and directed only by your conscience and your own concept of God, in a way that allows you to determine what is right for you, is so much more empowering. And we see that, like, if that was the modality that the leaders of the church had, then when people like Stuart Udall or Lowry Nelson back in the early 1900s would instruct them on concepts of human equality and love and empathy, then they could accept that, because they wouldn't have to say, well, wait a second, this doesn't make sense with what prior prophets have said. It's just that entrenched dogma that keeps people stuck in wrong avenues that has led to this problem. Anyway, thank you so much for your call.
Oh yeah, thank
and
you.
I appreciate
Appreciate
you
it. Yeah, that was very good.
listening all the way on the other side of the world. So I'll hang up now and see if anyone else wants to call in. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
All right, let's see. There was some other comments here. We have one comment. The race and priesthood essay and the race and priesthood issue is what broke my shelf. What are your thoughts on apologists saying prophets can make mistakes and are not infallible? To brush this issue aside, do you think the current leadership still believes in the pre-existence affecting this estate and just say what they feel the need to for the current political climate? That's a good question. I think that apologists now have to acknowledge on one hand that prophets can make mistakes. And you'll find that there are various different flavors of apologists. It becomes, once you acknowledge that prophets can make mistakes, and not just tiny mistakes, but deep foundational mistakes that are persisted. It's not just like, they have these racist ideas and no one ever taught them otherwise. It's that they have this racist ideas. You had people like Stuart Udall and Lowry Nelson completely confront those racist ideas and even give them a more enlightened and scripturally based rationale to throw away the bad ideas and to adopt a more loving and universal perspective. And they persisted in their false belief, rejecting what we now see as true moral principles. And so it becomes harder then to say, follow the prophet, if you acknowledge that prophets can make mistakes that are that deep and important. And so this is why when you meet apologists who are willing to concede that prophets can make mistakes, the next question for me is just kind of like, okay, I appreciate that. So you understand that prophets can be deeply wrong about important things. What is something that the prophet today is teaching or advocating that you think they got or they are getting completely wrong? And that's where you'll start to see whether or not an apologist is honest. Because if they say, well, there's nothing, I think we got rid of all the wrong stuff and everything that the prophet says now I believe, then all they're doing is simply doing the propaganda thing of creating an excuse that they'll allow for the past, but holding on to that hard line of follow the prophet. You can't criticize the prophet. You can only believe what the prophet says. Versus, and I've encountered both of them, apologists who you ask them, well, what is something that you think the prophets are doing wrong today that they'll fix in the future? And then they'll say, the common thing is how they're interacting with LGBT individuals. And so if you have an apologist who then is willing to concede that the church is teaching and doing false things now, then you have to talk about, okay, if we accept that, then what are the implications? Should we be teaching children to simply follow the prophet? Is there a better framework for developing individuals of moral character than simply to tell them to surrender their judgment and their conscience to some authority figure? Or is there a different paradigm that you can adopt other than follow the prophet? And that's where I think a lot of people that go through this process, like the caller talked about, when you accept that the church's claims are not true, you have to reinvent your life. And it's not just kind of what am I going to do on Sunday? A lot of it is, how do I now determine what is right and what is wrong? What is the foundation for my moral framework? And that, I think, is where you start to see Mormons coming out of Mormonism really start to develop in ways that they've been prevented from developing in the past. Because if your only way to strengthen your moral character or muscles in the past is, well, what did the brethren say? Let me see what the brethren said. Okay, that's what I believe. If you have to think through issues and really consider the impact and the effect and what it means to be human, what it means to violate somebody else's rights or dignity, then you really have to struggle with that. And you have to start develop a way to approach moral issues that strengthens you as a moral individual and character. And when you're confronted with competing ideas, you actually have to think about them and consider them, and you may find your mind changed about ideas because you don't have the crutch of, well, the prophet said this, so I don't even have to listen to what you say. You have to actually listen to what people say and consider it. And so I find that there's a great deal of personal growth that goes along with that. And in many cases, all the world around us, people maturing into adulthood have had to wrestle with those issues and have had the benefit of that personal growth. Whereas, I found myself, even into my 30s and late 30s, I hadn't had the opportunity to really assess my moral character, why I believed things were right and wrong. And it was until I was willing to do that. And I think my journey was a little bit different in that I was wrestling with issues of war and violence and state violence. I was a physician in the military, and I was seeing the lives and bodies and families of these people younger than me that were blown apart by going overseas and engaging in the wars that America was conducting. And I was struggling with, my principles as a doctor, as a physician, and as a Mormon. Was this the right thing to do? And that was kind of the crumbs that led me down the rabbit hole was, well, what do the Mormon prophets have to say about warfare? And then I discovered that it was pretty much just do what your government says, and to the extent that there were Mormon Nazis. And that led to a whole over avenue where I considered the possibility that Mormons and Mormon leaders could just speak things that were, in the interests of the church rather than actual moral principles. And it opened my mind to other possibilities, and that was what kind of started me. Okay, let's see. I'm recovering from a cold, so you'll have to excuse my voice. All right. Somebody says, as a know-it-all, arrogant teenager who respected and trusted my TBM parents and church leaders, I didn't question things until I grew up a bit into my late 20s. I'm so grateful for psychology and the internet. That's one of the things that not just the Mormon Church, but other groups will do, is they'll keep you so busy, so occupied with meetings, with publications, so many other things in your life and other expectations around the group that you never really have time to sit back and really consider and study these things out because you've always got things to do. And that's been, from when I look back on just the landscape of my own life, I had all my church callings, then I had schooling, then I had my work, then I had more church callings on top of that where I was working a couple of jobs and I was a scout leader. And it was just like there was no time to sit back and actually study and consider some of these very personal questions about, what constitutes your own moral character. And it was only when I got the time to sit back and do that and was able to make the time to do that I was able to really dig into these things. All right. How come the church, with all their, quote, truth, can't be confounded, or the truth that can't be confounded, how come they can't put a live stream phone number call-in show to answer everyone's questions? You obviously aren't scared, but they hide. I think this speaks to a question that a lot of us have is, why doesn't when there's a news conference, it's very, very rare that the prophets will speak extemporaneously and that they will answer questions and follow-up questions. Because it's not, the church and leaders, they prepare for certain questions that what they can't prepare for is the follow-up question. And there's a great, when President Nelson first became the prophet, there was like it was like unprecedented. There was a press conference, and they let members of the media ask questions of the brethren. And there's a video on my channel that you'll see where before President Nelson would answer a question, he would try to connect personally with the journalist. And so Peggy Fletcher Stack from the Salt Lake Tribune stands up to ask a question. And before getting to the question, President Nelson starts talking about how he knows the family and he remembers her and everything. It's a little bit creepy, but the thing that's even creepier is if you look at the lips of Elder Oaks right next to him. Elder Oaks is mouthing the words that President Nelson is saying. And then if you look at other pictures of the event, you can see that there are some teleprompters in there. And so even these things that are seemingly spontaneous are very, very scripted and controlled. And the thing is, though, the brethren don't want to be caught off guard. They don't want to be embarrassed in an interaction that is going to be broadcast around the world, because they've seen examples of that in the past. And if you Google Elder Holland and the BBC, you'll see one example where during the Mitt Romney campaign in 2008, a BBC reporter got an interview with Elder Holland. He didn't really know what they were going to cover, and you can see how poorly the leaders do in that sort of environment. And since they're not legally obligated to take spontaneous questions, there's no reason why they should do that. Mormonism isn't the only group that does that. David Miscavige, the leader of Scientology, famously gave some interviews with 2020 or something like that in like the early 90s or late 80s, and it was terrible for the group. And there's just been a policy after that. David Miscavige never gets interviewed by the media because it doesn't end up well for the group. And I think we're just seeing that sort of control. And what it has the effect of is, as members, since we never see the leaders outside of a controlled environment, we only conceive of them as these very well put together people who can give an inspiring answer seemingly off the cuff. But that's because all those environments are very controlled. Even the face-to-face events, there's a form of control that's pseudo-control where they say, oh yeah, just send any question at all is allowable. Send any question. We'll answer your questions live on air in a face-to-face event. And then when they have the event, it seems like, they usually have a co-host who's giving them the question, and they'll even say, we're getting a live question from Twitter. And so it seems like it's not scripted. There's no way it could be scripted, but what they're doing is they're being selective about the questions. They get to filter and only answer the questions that are easy to answer. And if they they say, I want to talk about A, B, C, and D, then if everybody is answering questions, then they just will answer if everyone's asking questions, they're going to get a buttload of questions, and all they have to do is just select the questions about A, B, C, and D, and then it'll seem like they've taken off-the-cuff questions when all they've done is they've come with very prepared things that they want to talk about. And, occasionally something will slip in. There's a video in one of the face-to-face events where Elder Rasband is taking questions from people in New Zealand. And a girl stands up and asks him a question about babies that die, and are they going to be resurrected? How will they be resurrected? How will that look? And if you're familiar with Mormon history, you know that Joseph Smith famously said that if an infant dies, then he'll be resurrected in the body of an infant, but he'll have the mind of an adult, and he'll reign in glory as an infant on thrones. And that's where the podcast Infants on Thrones gets their name from. But Elder Rasband is kind of taken off guard by this. He stutters a little bit, and he's like, I don't know the answer to that, but I'll look it up and I'll get it for you. So it was just a fun little moment. Okay. Again, the phone line is open if anyone wants to call in. 422-2222, area code 210. Robert Steinbeck says, what would ultimately cause church leadership to release its hold on this authoritarian system? Generations of members slowly becoming less obedient to them. Jana Reese's study shows that this is happening. I think this speaks a little bit to what we were talking about earlier, where the younger generation of Mormonism just kind of takes a completely different approach to church, where, they have no problem if I want to have a latte on Saturday and go to church on Sunday. It shouldn't, that's not, I'm not breaking any moral vice. I'm not stealing. I'm not hurting somebody else. And so there's no reason I shouldn't do that. And I think that mentality is becoming more accepted just because these, that's the mentality that a lot of young people are growing up among their non-Mormon peers. And I mean, probably some of the more effective arguments that I've been able to make to people have been based on moral principles, just like, is such and such right or wrong? And if you personally believe something is right or wrong, and then you see that the leaders of the church are imposing some different moral paradigm on it, how do you reconcile that? And you can start it from the Bible when you say, if the church is using lessons of God teaching slavery or genocide, why is the church not repudiating that rather than using that to teach obedience? All right, we've got a call. Let's see. Hello, you're on Talk on Think and Stuff.
For help in removing inaccurate items from your...
That would be spam call coming during the time. Okay, so the children's primary song called Follow the Prophet is the most obvious and blatant piece of child propaganda. It has purity and beauty as propaganda in that it's a catchy tune, it's repeated over and over again, and it's directed towards children. And there are some other examples in other religions of songs that really do this. If you Google "always submit to the church administration," you'll see a song from another high-demand religion that uses those same tactics. I do a podcast with a former Scientologist and a former Jehovah's Witness called The Three Apostates. And we have an episode talking about childhood indoctrination. And we compare how Scientology and Jehovah's Witness use psychological manipulation techniques to indoctrinate children to the way of thinking, and try to compare that with other methods of educating and bringing children up in ways that are not coercive and are not fueled by fear and authoritarianism. And the Follow the Prophet song comes up because we talk about how music and early indoctrination of ideas and principles encoded into music play a role in childhood indoctrination. All right. Well, I think that is all that we have in terms of calls. We have 4 more entries left in the Stuart Udall saga, in the Stuart Udall sequence. So in the next couple of days, we'll set up another time and do the next entry where we read what Stuart Udall did as a response to this letter that he got from the Brethren, which I'm sure he was disappointed with when you read what he then caused to be published. And he did it in a Mormon-centered magazine that was going to be distributed nationally or worldwide, and he wrote it as the sitting Secretary of the Interior. And so it made headlines at a time when there were other Mormon political figures, such as George Romney, who were rising to national prominence. And so there was a lot of national interest in the fact that a cabinet member who was a member of the Mormon Church was calling out the leaders of his own church to change and repudiate false racist ideas. This whole saga is just really inspiring because it really shows you how people of conscience in the past have stood up to some of these really strong religious authoritarians, and now that we see that they were standing for truth and rightness and love and compassion, and were met with just hate-filled ideology, it really gives you inspiration to try to do the right thing in your own life. Anyway, all right. Well, I think that will do it for us today, and I will see you next time on Talk and Things and Stuff.